next up, we have an interview. Tim Chrisman, our executive director, is going to interview uh, Pete Wilczynski, one of our favorite guests from a few months ago. Pete is the program executive at NASA headquarters, a U.S. Air Force veteran, expert in interagency and international collaborations in space system acquisition and development, satellite ops expert, and NASA HQ's Ombudsman and Aviator. We had a great conversation about being an ombudsman last time. Pete, welcome back.
Hi, Lee. Good afternoon. Good morning.
Great to see you.
Good to
And I'm
see
going
you.
to turn it over to Tim.
Thanks, Lee. Great to
Hey,
have you here,
Tim.
Pete. How are
Hey,
you?
thank you once again. I have background envy of models and rockets, as you can, right? I have the same issues.
Yeah, yeah. I like to tell people that if I'm going to be stuck working from my house, I might as well have fun with it, and people get to see a little piece of where I live.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. By the way, that previous segment, there's a lot to be said about articulating what we do in space to everybody in the community, and it was really fascinating to listen to. It's a really important aspect of everything we do, and I would say that as a government space guy, sometimes we don't do it well enough. So kudos to that segment. Well done.
yeah. No, I think Block by Block Creative does an exceptional job crafting those stories, and I mean, I came from Army and CIA, and so we were the last to ever get our messages out. I know NASA's getting a lot better with you all recently publishing like your state by state economic impact reports. And so I think that's been really helpful, and that's good to see.
Yeah, it is, and it's one of those things. We get caught up in our own niche of technicality, and we get consumed because we feed off of it with each other. That we forget that if you cannot explain this to somebody you're talking to at Starbucks, your overall question is, what does it matter to me? How does it impact humanity? That there it is, right there. If you can't explain it, that's part of our struggle.
Yeah, no, and that's, when we're going out talking, that's something that we repeatedly emphasize whenever we bring experts on or we go out to the community is, no, we're trying to assume nobody knows any acronyms. We're trying to assume that, we challenge experts to put it in the simplest terms possible, both because it's fun to watch people squirm, but also because we're trying to get the message out to a broad audience. And there's been too long where it's just been us talking to ourselves.
Indeed.
Yeah, but that gets me to my first question.
Yeah.
Like, how did you get into space? Where did this come from?
So thank you first of all, thank you for inviting me back. It's a great forum, and I'm highly supportive of what you are doing, Tim and Lee have been doing. It's again getting the right people together and continue the conversation. I started in aviation about 100 years ago in the service in the Air Force. I did a lot of flying in my early days, and once upon a time, the Air Force asked me if I wouldn't mind doing what do they call that? A career broadening assignment. Right? That's the military telling you that you're going to go do something completely different. And so I did, and I ended up going down to Johnson Space Center and working on shuttle, specifically military payloads that at that time in the late 80s, early 90s, were still at the tail end of, after Challenger reshaped the whole launch industry, we still had manifested military payloads that needed to go on shuttle. They were designed to go on shuttle bay deployments. So I was part of the cadre there. Caught the space bug after a year or two down there, and then did some time in classified space with the NRO. And then in the late 90s, got out of the service and became a civil servant, which I spent some time in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and now the last 6 or 7 years now with NASA at NASA headquarters. So that's sort of my abbreviated journey. and it is, it wasn't a clear path, but once you get on the path, it's the right one, right? You're connected, what gets you up in the morning. And as I talk to colleagues of mine, the thing that gets you up out of bed and you run to work, if you don't run to work, then, you're doing something wrong, right? I mean, you should be excited, right? Because it is work, right? We call it work for a reason. So if it's fun, then that's all part of it. So yeah, that's my journey.
Yeah, no, this morning I was talking about how I realized most of yesterday's speakers came to space mid-career. And so it was that transition where they'd been doing something else and maybe had always been interested in space, maybe not, maybe it just ran into it and sort of realized, and as you said, caught the space bug, and now are here. And so it is a cool story to hear, because it's not what you would stereotypically hear about space. We hear the astronauts training for 50 years or something like that.
Right. Well, it's a typical, especially since I was a military pilot. Everybody says, well, how come you didn't go into the astronauts? Well, the pedigree, as you guys know, the pedigree for to become a flight member of an astronaut team is extraordinary. I mean, not to mention test pilot school and, number one, number two of your class and so forth. And I did none of those things. so clearly, it was nice, but, not going to happen.
Yeah.
So, we figured out a different way to contribute, right?
Well, right. And, we only need so many astronauts and then so many PhDs and so many, and so on and so on and so on. Right. So when, you described your career, and when I was doing LinkedIn stalking, you've basically spent your entire career bridging organizations. Which, it looks like even early in your career, which was when I was busy smashing rival organizations in the Army and not being cooperative. But how do you bring that to what you're doing now there in NASA?
Well, that's a great question. And as you know from your own experience, boy, is that challenging in government, right? I mean, it's about the organizational moral equivalent of a constant root canal, right? I mean, it is really hard because institutionally, agencies, DoD, NASA, NOAA, any of the other spacefaring agencies in the US in particular, we are entrenched in what we've been doing because we've been successful, right? And to that end, we like it our way. We do it our way. We have our rule. NASA is, steeped in rules and regulations for obvious reasons, for safety and human spaceflight safety. But it is our signature. NASA's signature is exactly how thorough and, in fact, how deep we are in checks, double checks, triple checks. The whole multitude of things. But when you marry or try to get partnerships with different organizations, you may have similar sets of requirements and similar ways to get there, but it is always challenging to break out of those swim lanes that each particular partner can be caught into. And that has gotten better in government over time. It's not perfect, clearly. I work in an agency at NASA headquarters. I work in the Joint Agency Satellite Division. That, by virtue of our title, is exactly what we do. We bring interagency requirements from a different agency that's non-NASA, in this case, mostly NOAA, and we build their satellites for them. All of their operational fleets, NASA builds, we launch them for them, and we then give them back to NOAA to operate, which NOAA has been doing for a better part of 60 years, operating the nation's weather satellites. So that partnership with NOAA has been around for a very long time and continues to work. But it also, like any relationship, takes day-to-day maintenance and care and feeding, right? And it has come with different challenges. And then in this swirl of, particularly the last 10 or 15 years, as we've become globalized, we have global partners now, global space agencies, other, European Space Agency, Taiwan Space Agency, Japanese Space Agency, who are valued partners. And then we institutionally have to deal with their institutional elements as a government entity and their cares and needs. And it is challenging. And I spend a lot of of time, based on the experience that I've had with my colleagues at headquarters, it's basically in one way, a level of counseling that we have to learn how to talk with each other in a different way. Because you come from NASA, you talk this way. You come from NOAA, you talk this way. I'm at ESA, I talk this way. You have to figure out a different way to talk to each other and reestablish expectations and needs. And I'll say from a US perspective that we're certainly over the last couple of decades have gotten very good at that. There's always room to continue to grow that way, because it is specific. And, just because either NASA or DOD or any other agency has been doing it for 100 years, it doesn't make you necessarily entitled to that's the only way it can be done kind of methodology, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, I over the pandemic, I've gotten to hear some of my wife's calls. She works at the Federal Reserve Board, and some of the terminology where if I were to go into a meeting trying to talk with them, we would never get anything done, because what I'm thinking of as the correct term is not what they're using. And I can only imagine how much worse that gets than adding in the international layer to that.
Yeah. And to be completely frank, even NASA, so we have 10 centers, right? Geographically dispersed around the country, right? We talk differently amongst ourselves. So talk about the algorithm there to talk as a unit to somebody external. We have to counteract all the colloquialisms that exist between our different centers, whether you're at Johnson or Kennedy, or you're out west at Edwards. There's different elements of this and different cultures. So we cope with that as well.
Yeah, and I don't doubt that makes it hard then to get the message out about all the good stuff that is being done, especially the stuff that affects Earth.
Yeah.
That's probably more often what comes up when a appointee sends around a request for information, and everybody's like, well, this isn't my job. I'm trying to, do the first of this new amazing thing. But what are some of those messages that maybe aren't getting out as much about what, you see it, you're sitting between all these different agencies.
Yeah, and I would say that of all of the governmental agencies, I think historically, NASA has probably done better than others. Can clearly do more. This started with Apollo, with the whole premise that in the Kennedy administration, that the only way the U.S. population was going to embrace going to the moon, and the fortitude, both financial and otherwise, that was going to be needed by this nation to get there, we had to get public buy-in to this. And so NASA decided to do the public outreach of that. That basically is the foundational methodology of how NASA operates now to this day, based on what we did in the 60s and 70s with Apollo. We continue to talk about the goodness. We talk about the Earth and Earth science, and in particular, things related to Earth Day and how we try to convey the science. One of the elements that we, the space builders in the Earth science community, are learning is that we again get caught up in the world of the widgets of how great our little spacecraft is, or big spacecraft is, or what the instrumentation is, or how fascinating the technology is, because it certainly is. But at the end of the day, it is what happens to the user when they get it on their phone, right?
Yep.
Or whatever platform there is. Because once it's in their hands, it's manipulated. Like, you and I will look at the weather later this afternoon, see what's going on, so we can go take a run, walk, whatever we're doing to see what's happening. That's what we do. That's what we consciously do. And it is the providers of that data, satellite, in situ, terrestrial, all the providers of that data, that put this into the hands of not only qualified meteorologists to do this, but also those of us who are not qualified meteorologists just want to know, should we bring an umbrella or not? And it is that translation of creating data products that can be more easily used. I think one of the things that when we were exchanging emails earlier, I think I was thinking about with, how from a government perspective, cooperatively with industry, how can we partner in a better way? A lot of the things that the government does institutionally can provide larger platforms and make those big corporate if you will, kind of investments. But I think industry in many ways can help, in particular to earth science and basically our weather producing nation, is that, creating the kinds of products that become friendlier to use. This doesn't obviate, obviously, the need for professionals in the meteorological business to continue to do the fascinating and great work that they do. But this is clearly a different way now that people get data, and it's satellite and it's otherwise. And to that end, it's also has to do with even understanding our oceans. People that live on the coastline want to know sea surface height and things that are coming with an impending storm, a nor'easter, a coastal flooding situation. Does that affect my neighborhood? Should I be, migrating out of the neighborhood I live? Should I be moving other, home resources out of the way? These are all things that are now commonplace. This is how we operate now, and that data has to be easily understood, because unless it's actionable, again, by our whole constituency of citizens in the country and around the world, then who's it for? I mean, there's obviously a science element, clearly, but they're scientists. They're trained to do this. The rest of it is for the rest of the people to benefit from. And I think there's more work that NASA, NOAA, private industry can do to enable the data part. Once it's on the ground, what can we do with the data? Getting it somewhere else faster and making it better in terms of its platform delivery. Can it be, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Because, ultimately it's whatever you're doing, it's about the customer. And so I think, as you're saying, like, it's important, even if you can't upgrade the sensors that are already flying, you can make the back end, a little bit better, and always be improving your foxhole, as we used to say in the Army.
Data exploitation, really. Because like you say, on orbit, thanks to physics, we can't do much once it's on orbit. We can't do much. However, data on the ground can continue to be processed and reprocessed and manipulated and remanipulated in different ways. And if you add, some of I say this often to my 20-year-old geoscience daughter who's studying geoscience. I say, if you applied, sort of Pixar technology, like from the Hollywood animation stage, and you apply that to atmospheric science, for example, what does that do for atmospheric science? How do you interpret data? How does a picture then, because at the end of the day, the picture is the 1,000 words, right? So how does a picture, something that shows up here, how does that change, how that data is interpreted? The value of that asset that's thousands and millions of taxpayer dollars on orbit, what does that mean to me?
Yeah, no, exactly. I do want to ask, and so I am exceptionally bad at follow-up questions, but we're talking about these satellites that you're the program executive for, the Joint Polar Sensing
Satellite System.
There we go. I know from reading a little bit about it that it represents sort of a phase shift in accuracy, detail, and the like, but like what does it give me different?
JPSS, the Joint Polar Satellite System, is the continuation of a nearly 45-year climate data record that was established by NOAA of polar satellites that have been flying around our planet since 50, nearly 50 years ago. Okay. The data generationally, as all these satellites have matured generationally, is highly more accurate, temporally sensitive. Its accuracy and calibrations are becoming almost absolutely perfect with the advent of adding GPS to a lot of our signals now. We can get a near perfection. And so what happens is this particular data set of this 2,600 kilo satellite, it's a very good sized satellite. Yeah. With 4 or 5 instruments on board that take a multitude of data down. What this data feeds for my customer, the National Weather Service, NOAA, it feeds them the basic data that's needed to generate into their atmospheric models,
Yeah.
basic data that they need to get a steady state condition to allow other data to be added into their weather models, such as geostationary data, observational data, radar data, all of that together, that they can ensemble this data and then give it to a human in the form of a meteorologist that can look at this and then project, right? 1 day, 3 day, 5 day, 7 day type forecasts. And so the basis, the anchor of that model is these polar orbiting satellites, has been for nearly 40 years. And the accuracy of that first get, if you will, of that model, that weather model, that first time, the accuracy of that is really what allows the high level of accuracy that our nation's forecasters, both public, private, and governmental forecasters, that allows them to take a really good look and make some powerful judgments on what's happening with high confidence of the data, right? So that's in 30 seconds or less what JPSS provides. It does many other things, but that is the core essence of what it does for my customer NOAA.
Okay, so I remember reading early in COVID that something about how weather forecasts got worse because fewer planes were flying and feeding that data into the National Weather Service. But you all are doing the step or two before that.
Yeah, so satellite-based data tends to be the backbone, the anchor, because once on orbit, always on orbit. It stays, it's absolute until failure. Not gonna, it stays and it's absolute, and it is the anchor. Yeah, the other terrestrial observations from airplane, other in situ observations, observers around the country and around the globe, balloons, different and radars, all of that contribute to that whole ensemble that a forecaster then looks at and starts predicting the out days with relative confidence, right? Because the confidence, at the end of the day, what we want to get to is a forecast, right? This is what you and I want when we want to go out for a run or a walk. We want to know that tomorrow's forecast, its confidence is the same for Saturday. When we look at Saturday, and it's a few days away, and how things can change, but if you can forecast with that same level of confidence at 24 hours, at 48 or 72 hours, now you've accomplished something. And I'll just say that the National Weather Service and Hurricane Center and all the other components of Weather Service have done remarkable jobs. Let's look at the hurricane season here just recently. I mean, predictions of landfall for hurricanes and the amount of saturation in terms of these wet rain events and the saturation have been predicted nearly perfectly. Is a tough word to say because it's never perfect.
You're good.
High confidence, confidence, and that's just not satellite, but that's the whole ensemble of predictions, and that's what got people out of Louisiana safely. That's what kept the death toll virtually non-existent as compared to going up the East Coast, and forecasts weren't taken as seriously. The emphasis wasn't given. And here again, communication is a little bit of a breakdown from how we try to inform people that this rain was coming, and it came, and it is coming. I mean, just looking at the Washington Post this morning, talking about the UN Climate Agency, talking about, are we ready for how much water the planet's going to get in the so this is not the new normal. This is just normal.
I'm definitely not ready. I got to clean my gutters. But
make sure you check the forecast before you get on the roof.
Yeah, there we go. So with JPSS, you said it's the continuation or sort of the next phase, but how much better the data and on-orbit stuff's getting, where does this go next?
Great question. So I will say that there's obviously a huge look at partnership with the commercial entities that are producing smaller constellation of constellations that are going to do very specific measurements, right? Perhaps, a Battlestar Galactica type of satellite like JPSS at 2,600 kilos has a multitude of things it's sensing. Smaller satellites on the order of 6, 12, 24U can do single component, single parameter kind of measurements in high volume, in high concentration, if they formation fly or otherwise. The commercial industry is really being very innovative here. And this is where the partnerships with government can come into play. This is where the overlap of requirements becomes significant. Government has a need for the data, and has a need for accuracy and the science capability. And the providers are getting them up there and getting data. And I think it's going to converge on a pretty decent solution. It's working in areas of radio occultation, for example. There's some providers of radio occultation. This is where you look at the bending of the GPS signal through the atmosphere, and that bending delta can tell you elements of precipitation and pressure change in the atmosphere. It's fantastic science. We can have another talk about that another day. But that is another GPS-based signal that is so particularly accurate that it is so helpful to the weather prediction element that we were talking about earlier. These things like this, those types of instruments can be flown by industry and entrepreneurs in the commercial business, and in partnership with the government, may find itself in a pretty decent marriage. And there will be others like that. We're already talking about other sounding. Sounding is when you take a measurement of temperature and pressure through the atmosphere. They refer to that as a sounding. These sounding measurements that can be done by smaller satellites, and multitudes of them, will probably be somewhere where we partner, because the innovation that industry drives is something that, from an agility perspective, the government is not quite as good that way in terms of that fast-paced developmental deploy, put it into service. We operate at a much slower, much more methodical deployment sequence. And I think that's an opportunity for a large-scale partnership, and the small sat constellations of satellites really does.
Yeah, for sure. I would imagine you could, contract as almost a subscription service and lower the overall program cost.
Yeah, and what gets sorted out there again is the data and who manages the data. Once it gets on the ground, there's a lot more work to be done there in terms of how best to do that. But it has potential. It really does.
Yeah. So then, as you're going forward. I come from national security space, where even though the DoD is buying commercial imagery, they're still running dedicated platforms to do classified work.
Right.
Is there a plan for a similar model there with NASA and NOAA? There's like a dedicated persistent system that provides the backbone, and then you just contract out the rest.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the government has identified through the science community, and of course through the national academies, has decided that certain variables that we study for climate are absolute. And the study of climate over time is really one of the big things that climate scientists do. They trend it, they look at it, besides day-to-day operational forecasts. But then the long-term use is that continuity of that record. And so this is where the stability of government systems helps maintain that stability of that record. We've looked at these images in 1962, we'll look at them in 72, we'll look at them at 82, we'll look at, you look at that continuity of a data set. That is really important to make sure that we plan correctly for the ever-changing planet. Now, operationally though, the other elements of environmental sensing will evolve to be, I suspect it will be many commercial partnerships, and it could be and then partnerships to get the data down and share the data. Then product sharing is the next stage of that, because sensing it is one thing. You kind of put water on it and it blossoms. Once you get it on the ground, and you create products of that data, because it's ones and zeros until you make a pretty picture out of it, right?
Exactly.
So, I think there's a lot more to be done there, and a lot more to be shared. Because the government doesn't need to do all that, but that clearly can be shared expensed in the future. We have a long way to go with that still, but I think it's encouraging, because I think the price points for everybody are going to work out quite well.
Yeah, no, it definitely seems so. When you were talking about the continuity of record, I remember seeing there's a handful of different measurements of the climate over the past 100 years where there's like gaps. And it's always awkward if that's your field of study and you're like, sorry, our bad.
Well, you'll ask leadership across the government and across municipalities will ask scientists to say, has this ever happened in the last 50 years?
Hmm.
Well, I only have 20 years of records,
Yep.
or I have segmented, 30 years.
Yeah.
And so it puts an inherent bias into that data or to your answer. It gives a bias to your answer to go, well, I don't have all the data, but I think,
Yeah.
and that's unfortunate. What we want is a complete, all these climate variables that have been studied and annotated as the most essential are well known, and that's what some of these legacy systems are doing for the government from both the NASA perspective and from NOAA.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think we're right at time here, but thanks, Pete.
It goes by quick, man.
I know, right?
It does. Great conversation. There's a lot more to be to talk about on these topics. Any one of these topics could be a separate, TED talk, clearly. But thank you, Tim, for the invitation. I'd love to chat some more. So I'll take any questions or anything else that anybody has from the audience or anywhere after the call. I'll be happy to talk about.
Cool. Thanks, Pete.